Welcome to Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. A world where coming in second place is not an option, but where principle-centered winning is the only approach.
Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Government Contracting Weekly. I'm Hilary Fordwich from Key Solutions. All of us in the government contracting arena recognize that even as we seek to win or retain government contracts, we must learn to respond to the new reality, or what some refer to as the new normal. To discuss this new reality, our first guest is Eric Spittle, the president of SSL Federal, who offered some very relevant thoughts. Here's Eric. Good morning and welcome to our segment where we have with us a local expert, a government contractor this morning, is Eric Spittle, the president of SSL Federal. Good morning, Eric. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
And I'd love for you to share with the audience. Most members of the audience have probably heard about Loral, and you've heard of Loral historically, but SSL Federal is now doing different things in the geo-stationary space. So explain to our audience what you're doing and how now you're different than Loral.
Well, people do tend to know us as Loral. We're really known as Space Systems Loral, which was originally owned by a U.S. company in New York. We were recently sold to McDonald, Detweiler and Associates. Loral has a long history of geostationary communications specialty in the commercial realm. MDA is basically Canada's largest defense contractor. In the history of the two have a tremendous history of firm fixed price contracting, so we have very similar cultures. And now you can blend the efficiency and expertise of the commercial world with the heritage and breadth of the domain knowledge that MDA Canada has in the defense industry. And now you've created SSL Federal, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of SSL, focused on government products and services, expanding everything that MDA was trying to do in the U.S. by U.S. citizens on U.S. soil with the U.S. company on U.S. contracts.
Which is what everybody wants here. They want an American company to work with. Yes.
Exactly.
And Eric has actually something that I find rather interesting, and I hope you do too. In his background, around the time of the first Gulf War, when you were with the Air Force, you could say actually, I guess, 30 seconds of fame, 30 minutes of fame, but it's really rather interesting. Maybe share with our audience.
Right. This is actually the second time I've had an opportunity to be interviewed for television. Once before when I was lieutenant, because I served in the Air Force before I joined SSL. Just before the first Gulf War started, I was in a research laboratory doing some ejection safety testing, and at the time there was a technology program and they were looking at different programs in the Air Force Research Laboratory. I was asked to be interviewed for that, and just as they produced the segment, the first Gulf War, one of the Navy pilots ejected, and that certainly became headline news. And so every 30 minutes for about a day and a half, part of the segment that they interviewed me was aired on headline news. So I've had a little bit of fame. It's pretty exciting.
Right. Eric, share with our audience, why are you going more into the federal market? How are you going about so? I'm expecting that you will share with us all of your secrets, all of your secret sauce, and that our audience can walk away and do the same thing.
But we can't do all that.
No.
But SSL actually has been around for 55 years and really started off more in the defense industry and grew into the commercialization piece in the late 70s and 80s when that market was just beginning. It wasn't until late in the 90s, the dot-com boom, and then after 2000, where we really focused on commercial, because that market was incredibly growing.
A hot place to be
Absolutely.
at the time, yeah.
And we really focused away from that. And at the same time, the Defense Department was kind of going through the time of TISPR and moving away from those standards. We never did that. And I think that's one of the recipes that's helped us grow so dramatically in the commercial market. And once we've reached about 40% of the geo market, we sort of realized the rest of the customers aren't going to really allow us to grow much larger. So
you had it dominated, really, that space, to the extent you could, yeah.
So it just became logical for us to grow into an adjacent market and sort of put our roots back in the Defense Department. So when we talk to customers about what we do commercially, there's a lot of confusion as to, commercial, that sounds like it's really scary and plastic parts and things break. It's just the opposite when you really take, the cover off and look underneath the hood. They're very impressed with the mill standards and mill specs and mission assurance that we've used. The fixed price programs and contracts we deliver in 2 to 3 years instead of 7 to 10 years.
Because you've had to be really competitive being in the commercial space for all this time, so you're bringing that competitiveness to the federal market.
Absolutely.
Yes.
One of our best customers says you're only as good as your last satellite.
That's right. Oh yeah, right.
And every commercial competition is 4 to 5 to 6 companies usually competing on one satellite acquisition every time. It's not a program of record where you're guaranteed that work for the next 20 or 30 years. You have to be on your game every single year, 5 to 6 times a year to win those awards.
And you can't really fail. It's a huge, because it's so prominent. It would be sort of like, you know, there are more people that die on the roads every day in America, but always you hear about an airline going down. You really can't fail with satellites, because that's going to bring down a lot.
Well, we're so dependent on it, we don't even realize it.
Yeah.
You're just gassing up your car, the credit card transaction, the financial, the GPS, the Dish, DirecTV, Sirius Radio. Those are all satellites that we've built, manufactured. We broadcast the Super Bowl on many different stations. If it goes down, just like this last year where the power went out, the whole world knows and nobody's happy.
No, that's right. So it's a very high-profile market you're in, yes.
Exactly. So those are the kinds of reasons I think that we bring a lot of capability just in the communications market to the Defense Department, particularly at a time of budget constraints, as you've mentioned, and the need to disaggregate. There's a lot of competition out there from other countries, a lot of unintentional interference as well as intentional interference, and so there's a lot of demand. Matter of fact, we had Futron a few years ago do a study, and during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, 25% or more of DoD communications was being transponded over SSL manufactured satellites. But we didn't have a single defense contract at the time.
You can say, even though we weren't contracting with you at the time, you were already using our products. So you can leverage past performance from the commercial sector, and the government trusts it.
Right. When your satellites are only down maybe on average 3 minutes a year, it's much better than the typical DoD constellation can provide.
Great. As is said, it's not the challenges we're dealt in life, it's how we choose to and how we cope with them. So in your space, of course, you've obviously faced challenges. You've come from the commercial sector. You've obviously been able to, as we just mentioned, use a lot of your great track record with the government already using your products in the Iraq war. But what are some of the challenges you face that maybe our audience can learn from? Some of those lessons learned from those?
Well, there's a lot of brand recognition that's the most important part. You mentioned that a lot of folks know us as L'Oreal and we're rebranding as SSL. But when we first started re-entering the government market, people would look at our name when we'd send pamphlets before we'd go in and say, oh, L'Oreal, we didn't realize the makeup company was in space.
Oh, yes, no, right.
So we had a long way to go to even get some...
And you say we're not up against Estée Lauder in this cockpit, are we? Yeah, right.
So the first few visits with senior leadership was just kind of reorienting me as to what our heritage was. It takes a lot of time. That's one of the challenges because there is a fairly small defense industrial base, particularly on the space side.
Yes.
And
it's almost minute. I mean, it's only a few of you.
Exactly. Yes. And there's obviously a congressional constituency associated with that. When we come in as a prime contractor, which are basically building the satellite platforms themselves instead of just the sensors, it takes a while to get that recognition. And the Defense Department, as well as the civil agencies, are so spread out geographically and organizationally. You can't just go to one place and expect that information to filter down.
And if it does, will it even be accurate? Even if it did filter down, what is that, the message
That's
about,
very true as well.
When the message changes through the trenches, you know,
yes.
You don't want to depend on them to give you messaging anyway.
And we certainly don't want our competitors to rebrand us. So we have to be out there and work that over time. And with the constant rotation of civilians and military people, it's an ongoing activity all the time.
Yes.
But we have made ground, and it's important to get to the right people, the change agents in the federal government, who definitely realize that what we're doing and have done is not going to work in the future. Those are the people we're really most interested in. And those are the people at the top, as well as the real change agents who are program managers or principal investigators at the bottom who want to change and have that passion. They're the ones we're most excited about.
And you can't go to just lesson learn, don't just go to one constituent, make sure you're giving your message and not that your competitor is giving your message for you. And you're telling it correctly. Thank you. Of course, as you know by now, Key Solutions is the force behind Government Contracting Weekly, and Key Solutions provides strategy, capture and proposal support services to government contractors to help them win major contracts, all with a principle-centered approach. This morning, Eric Spittle, the president of SSL, has been with me, and now, Eric, I'd love to turn to, obviously, you're very successful in this space, and you've grown extensively over the last just even couple of years. There are certain keys you have to success. Obviously, our audience wants to know everything that you do, because they want to beat you in that space. But what would you want to share that you would look at and say, those are really our top keys to success in terms of winning contracts?
Well, on the commercial side, it's all about building relationships. There are really only 25 to 30 customers worldwide. And as I mentioned earlier, there's only 20 to 25 possibly satellites awarded a year, so it's not the iPad kind of market. And so you have to develop those relationships over a long time, and you need to continue to make sure that you live up to the expectations of those customers. One fact that my boss, John Shelley, the president of SSL, is very proud of, at the commercial conference this spring, there was a panel of manufacturers, and it was an audience poll taken real time. Which manufacturer of the 6 worldwide provides the best customer service? And SSL had 75% of that vote, and we're very proud of that.
That's great.
That's exactly the kind of relationship building we want to do with the government, because it's all about providing the capabilities that the government needs. And we just want to leverage what we've done commercially, what we now have access to from our new owners in terms of breadth of and depth of technology and capabilities across a much broader spectrum, and put those experiences together for our customers and make them winning solutions.
Yes, and when you mentioned about the audience voting, that you are the most trusted firm in terms of your products, that's always so much more powerful to have somebody else saying about you than you saying it about yourself. So it's not marketing fluff, it's actually data from the marketplace, which is very powerful.
And one of the things that we've also done is the Aerospace Corporation had sort of done an independent mission assurance assessment. As I mentioned, we had never really deviated from those standards and specs.
Yes.
And we wanted to help get an independent validation of really what are we doing on the commercial side. And they've been extremely positive, and that's been a tremendous help for us to our customers, because they're a trusted agent of the government. And so I agree with you. It's important both from the customers as well as an independent technical assessment to say, really, this is the kind of company that you can trust, you can work with, and will provide you the kind of solutions you need.
A third-party endorsement versus internal sort of navel-gazing. Yeah. Eric, thank you for joining me this morning. Really appreciate you coming in.
It's been my pleasure, Hillary. Thank you very much.
Just as Eric Spittle and SSL Federal deal in a very dynamic area, perhaps there's no more fluid sector than that of cybersecurity. Now I'd like you to hear from Anup Ghosh, the CEO of Invincea, who every day is on the front line of cyber warfare. Welcome to our segment where we have with us a local government contracting expert, and this morning I'm delighted to have with us Anup Ghosh, the president and founder of Invincea. Good morning, Anup.
Good morning, Hillary.
Thank you for coming in to join us and speak to our audience.
Thank you.
And Anup has, I think, really a very interesting story, because Anup was working at DARPA, he was a program manager, and then he had the entrepreneurial spirit to go out and start a company on his own, and that isn't usual, somebody leaving government to do so. So what was your inspiration? Why did you decide to do it? And share with our audience.
Sure, absolutely. So DARPA is a slightly unusual place in the government. DARPA is part of the Department of Defense, but it's an agency that's focused on technology innovation, in particular game-changing approaches. So before I went to DARPA, I was in the private sector in a software consulting type of company.
And it's attracting then very entrepreneurial type people, because you're thinking out of the box and very innovative.
Absolutely. At DARPA, it is a limited term appointment from 2 to 4 years. So going in, you know you're going to have to leave. You don't know where you'll go afterwards. But when you're inside the crucible at DARPA, it's all about technology innovation. So when I was at DARPA, I was starting cybersecurity programs, and as part of that process, you know, we developed a number of interesting technologies that today are fielded in the Department of Defense.
So you're cutting edge. Everybody there's cutting edge. Everybody there's dynamic and got great new ideas and looking at new things.
It's a very entrepreneurial place to be. You have to pull together your own team. You've got to pull together a program, develop new technologies, figure out ways of bringing it to market. In this case, the market was the Department of Defense, which is the military services. So yeah, I mean, it's about mustering money. It's about putting it to work, creating new technologies, and bringing it to market.
Great. And why Invincea? What was it about what Invincea does, which actually maybe you can share with our audience?
Sure. So the problems that I was trying to solve were the nation-state threats against the Department of Defense. And my observation was the way they're attacking us is they target our users, our employees. And so if we could simply...
Because they're more vulnerable, maybe, and they don't have the same kind of discriminators as people.
Absolutely. So your users are constantly pulling in content from the internet. Some of that content is really bad, right? So the idea behind Invincea was, how do we develop a technology that allows users to go on the web, view all this internet content, while not inheriting the risks behind that content.
And that's a fascinating concept. No wonder it's been successful, yeah. just so that you know how special Invincea is, they recently won an award from the Government Security News at the 4th Annual Homeland Security Awards event in Washington, D.C., which I think is important to your firm because it's a third-party endorsement. It's not just you saying, well, we have great software here and what we're doing is wonderful. It's an important award for your company.
It absolutely is. It was recognition, and this was the best anti-malware award. So it's recognition that this whole space of cybersecurity is demanding new approaches, like our approach we bring to market, which really turns traditional antivirus on its head.
And since it's, when you speak about traditional, I think traditionally people have thought about filters, but what you have created is not a filter.
No, the way to think about what Invincea does is it creates an environment, we call it a bubble affectionately, so that when your users are online, they're in this protective bubble. And if they happen...
Isolated and insulated.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So insulated from the rest of the network and your data. So if you happen to click on a link that takes you to some place that's really bad and it runs malicious code, it detonates inside this bubble. And that protects the rest of your system and your data from compromise.
So basically then you are prevented from the risk of your entire system going down.
Exactly, and losing your data. And the key part of this is we don't need to have signatures of bad threats ahead of time. That's where the fundamental problem with today's approaches is that they require foreknowledge of the threat in order to protect you against it.
Well, if you had foreknowledge of it, then you'd probably try to prevent it anyway. So
yeah,
it doesn't make sense, really.
Exactly.
Yes.
But that's the old way. The new way is really putting people in these bubbles, we call them virtual containers, that protect them against these types of threats, including what are called zero-day exploits, which are previously unknown exploits.
Sorry, that was zero-day exploits.
Zero-day exploits. Previously unknown exploits against systems.
So and really this is you're taking this to the government as a government contractor as well as to industry.
Yeah, so our firm has both a nice commercial footprint as well as a growing government footprint. So our heritage is DARPA-funded work. We have a group called Invincea Labs that continues to do government-funded, contracted research and development. And that's a great business. In fact, it's really our skunk works for a commercial product group.
Wonderful.
So we're participating in DARPA's Plan X program, which is developing next-generation cyber defenses against the threat. And these types of technologies developed under government contract become the skunk works and the roadmap for our future products that we bring to market.
And when you say about future threats and future products, what percentage of attacks do you think are undetected?
Today, if you think about all the attacks, there's more than 200,000 new malware variants a day that the antivirus industry knows about.
Where are they coming from? Everybody, I think, usually thinks of China. Who are these people? Who are the bad guys?
Yeah, so they come in different categories. A lot of it is cybercrime driven. That's what all of us...
Like the ATMs that were raided in New York.
Yeah, and identity theft, that's a good example as well. But then you have the hacktivists, people with an agenda, political agenda. You've got the nation-state threat where they're focused on intellectual property of our country, and other types of even your competitors, right? So other types of adversaries that are after your data.
Yeah, like countries that are after our data.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. So many commentators and many of us have speculated that the next global war or next major conflict will not be fought with guns and tanks and on the battlefield and in the trenches, but rather will be cyber warfare. Do you ascribe to and believe that that is accurate?
Well, that's absolutely what's going on right now. If you look at today's conflicts, it is a combination of cyber with physical and kinetic exercises. So already, when we look at the conflict in Syria, we're talking about their integrated air defense systems.
Assad has been very proactive on that. Yes.
Right, and so obviously if there were to be an air incursion into Syria, probably the first thing they would do is take out those integrated air defense systems, probably by cyber means.
Yes. And where do you see most of the potential for that? Do you think China is, you always hear about, there are buildings, I've actually seen a photograph of a building that they say all the cyber attacks are coming from in China that's actually assigned to this. Is that true, and how would you expand upon that?
So Mandiant put out a report called the Mandiant APT-1 report in January. And
that was that building.
That was that building. That's
yes.
where they're based. And they kind of provided this irrefutable evidence of everything that the China's PLA is doing against U.S.-based private companies, right? And a lot of that is theft of intellectual property. But from a
national security standpoint,
what we're really worried about is what other actions might China and other nation states be taking against our critical infrastructures.
In terms of what, like pulling down our national grid and...
Absolutely. So we know that there have been attacks and exploits against our power generation facilities. These facilities are on internet-based networks, and so they suffer the same sorts of vulnerabilities we see in our corporate networks.
So we could have an attack without one bullet being shot and with one bomb being dropped.
Absolutely.
Exactly what you're saying. Yes.
Yes. I mean, we count on global commerce for our military operations just to move material into theater. By taking down the ability to ship, for instance, that removes our ability to wage wars.
And what do you think about, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, Anup, but do you think that it's ethical that, you know, everything you're talking about is on the defensive side, that we need to be defensive? And I can't imagine many people that would be watching who would disagree with that. What about the ethical questions about, is it ever justified that we would go on offense?
So it depends on who we are, right? So certainly from a U.S. government perspective, absolutely. From an individual or private corporation perspective, you have to be extremely careful. There is law, U.S. law, that makes that illegal.
Prohibits that,
right.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that you should just stand there and take punches, right? So what we really need to do is develop adaptive defenses that react to how you're being attacked.
So proactive defenses.
Proactive defenses.
Yes. Anticipating.
Anticipate, but also reveal who your adversary is. So in Invincea, when you do get virtually compromised, we get key forensic information that leads us back to who the adversary is.
Oh, so you're identifying them in
advance. We're able to identify them based on the forensics, just like a crime scene investigator would do. So what do you do with that information? You take it to law enforcement, right? And then you use the levers of government to apply pressure back on these other countries.
So that is really, that's perfect. As you've already seen, Anup has great vision, great insights, and a tremendous entrepreneurial spirit. So I'm excited to ask you questions about gazing into the crystal ball, because I think you have some opinions on this. So in terms of the future, what do you look at when you see trends on the horizon? What would you want to say to our audience in terms of the trends in cybersecurity?
So in our space, it's a very dynamic, very fast-moving space, particularly around the threat. We need to be able to rapidly understand the threat, develop technologies, and deploy those. In the federal space, what that really means is we need innovation in acquisition and procurement of new technologies. So we've seen some interesting programs. At DARPA, they have a cyber fast track program. Unfortunately, it's just ending, but really the procurement times were as short as 6 days. Which is great.
I mean, whoever thought the government would be able to act and jump like this? The government is not renowned for that.
Absolutely. And that was another case of DARPA innovating procurement process, right? We also are in a program called Transformative Apps, which was a really interesting program where battlefield apps are being developed on Android devices in near real time based on experiences that soldiers have in field.
Phenomenal, phenomenal. Who would have ever predicted?
Yeah, so what we need to do on the government side is not only innovate in procurement and acquisition, but get away from mandating security controls and actually be a leader in innovation themselves. So begin to adopt rapidly new technologies that address today's threat and tomorrow's threat, rather than taking long procurement cycles, adopting old technology models.
And if you had some advice to give to our audience in terms of what should they look for in terms of the opportunities in the cyberspace? You've already mentioned, obviously, that people should have security clearances. Anything else? You mentioned mobility, you mentioned Android. Anything else?
So technology innovation, right? So we don't do enough technology innovation. I think we are far too focused on servicing a problem, and that really is the whole professional services industry. We need to, as a nation, for all the reasons we talked about, innovate in technology, innovate so we can have proactive defenses against these threats. So focusing our best engineering talents and resources on innovation on the government side, innovating in our acquisition cycle to bring these new technologies to protect our national assets is really where we need to head.
Yeah, and it sounds like you are heading there and you're on the cusp of that.
I am, thank you.
That's part of your success. So, Anup, thank you for coming in this morning. Appreciate you coming to the studio.
Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you. Particularly because we're in such a tough environment, contractors just can't afford to make any mistakes. And that all begins with ensuring RFP compliance. Let's hear from Lois Gannon, Vice President and colleague of mine from Key Solutions. Good morning, Lois.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
A lot of government contractors know, and I would think anybody pretty much watching knows, that you must comply to win a government contract. So we're assuming that everybody would like any additional tips you can give them in terms of what does it take to make sure that you're in compliance with that RFP?
Well, first and foremost, I think that as a proposal manager, I must confess that other things can be delegated, but RFP compliance can never be handed off to anyone else.
Who doesn't know the compliance regulations.
So it's totally up to the proposal manager to take hold of the RFP and to become intimately familiar with every single element and section, clause, and provision in the RFP. In order to be able to ensure compliance. So that's the starting point, is understanding the requirements. And the second thing is developing a compliance traceability matrix so that every single one of the requirements in the RFP and every one of the provisions is mapped to the proposal.
So nothing slips through the cracks and nothing is missed out. Yes.
Right. So an outline that I develop is, according to our specifications here at KSI, is an annotated outline that's very precise and embeds all of the requirements from all of the sections of the RFP so that there's nothing left out. And then I take the next step, which is to enable the writers to work from a writer's template that in fact has those requirements embedded in it also.
So you've already laid that out, so they're not going to miss something because they literally have to fill in the boxes.
Right.
Fabulous.
So it makes it easier for them so that they're not just writing to a title, but they're writing to the actual requirements and the evaluation criteria, which is really important.
That's fantastic.
And otherwise, subject matter experts may just write to the statement of work, for example.
Right. And those SMEs, they come in and they get that from you because you're leading as that whole proposal manager in charge of everything. So then it's not going to come outside of the proposal.
And that way it's much easier to parse out so that everyone has a workable document, self-contained, and they're able to go off and do their work using the knowledge that they have.
And probably efficiently too, so it's good in terms of time usage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're not having backs and forwards in terms of communication. What do we do or not do? Do I do this part or not?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Lois, that's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure you've seen firsthand that the new reality is here to stay. That's why the insights brought to us this morning by Eric Spittle of SSL Federal, Anup Ghosh of Invincea, and Lois Gannon of Key Solutions are so critical to successfully winning or retaining government contracts in this economy. We thank Eric, Anup, and Lois for their thoughts, and we thank you, the government contracting community, for joining us at Government Contracting Weekly. See you next Sunday.
You've been watching Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored each week by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. For additional information, comments, questions, or suggestions, please write us at governmentcontractingweekly.com.